Sir, the Minister has highlighted the profound implications of the shifting global order on Singapore, and I share his concerns. However, beyond the risks and the threats, what opportunities can Singapore seize in this new environment? How is the government positioning us to be able to benefit from these changes? For instance, as the global power dynamics shift, smaller and medium-sized countries may be open to seeking closer economic and security ties with Singapore. Is the government stepping up its outreach to these nations by expanding its network of overseas missions and trade offices? Secondly, the Minister highlighted our deep reliance on both the US and China, economically for both and on security for the US. However, he did not address how we plan to reduce the risks of over-dependence on them. Does the government have a plan for that? And lastly, I think the Minister did not respond to my cut about the public diplomacy front. How is MFA stepping up the public diplomacy front and using that to be able to explain to Singaporeans about our strategic interests? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Just two clarifications. The first is, I think, pulling together the different threads on multilateralism. I think it's quite clear that the current US administration has moved away from the multilateral approach. But what seems to emerge is many other countries, including Europe, Japan, and even China has said it's bringing its disputes to the World Trade Organization. So is it possible that there are divergent currents, and there are in fact many countries that still believe in multilateralism, and it would still be possible to work on that positive views towards multilateralism and build more networks for Singapore, which I think we're already doing. The second is I'm grateful to, I think, Minister Maliki for sharing the principled approach we've taken in relation to Palestine and for reminding this House that we have taken a strong view against the illegal actions taken by Israel in the occupied territories. Now, one of the issues that I think many agencies providing aid are facing is that aid is not actually reaching the recipients. What has Singapore's experience been with aid reaching the recipients? And if we have been successful, what has helped with that? Thank you.
Minister Balakrishnan.
Mr. Vikram Nair is right. There are still many countries who realize that it is in our enlightened long-term interest to support multilateralism and international law. And you've just mentioned the list would include Europe, it would include Southeast Asia, and even in the longer run, certainly South America and Africa. But we also need to be realistic that if the big powers with a lack of strategic trust and trying to stay ahead are willing to take liberties with multilateral, or maybe the other way I would express it is they are not willing to be restricted and tied down by the restraints of multilateralism or international law. And given their current imperative to stay ahead of each other, it will be very difficult to operate. Because they will say, no, I have not, I mean, for instance, there are major powers that have not signed on to UNCLOS. There are major powers which are not signed on to the Paris Agreement. And it is very hard to make these agreements enforceable, implementable, without the participation of major powers. And that's the point I'm making. So it doesn't mean we give up. In fact, it means the rest of us need to double down, need to do our best to support the WTO and WHO, to support the UN, to continue to make the point that the UN Charter is essential, and that if the UN goes the way of the League of Nations, then we're in very, very dangerous territory. You can take your favorite historical allusion. Are we in a pre-World War I phase, which was characterized by empires reaching their limits, globalization in an empire way was coming to an end, and then you had World War I, at least 4 empires were destroyed by it. But then even in the aftermath of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, the reparations, the territorial boundaries redrawing in Germany, the Great Depression in the 1929 onwards, you had a world with beggar thy neighbor policies, depression, grievance, and the domestic rise of Nazism, fascism, all the isms. And that really set the stage for World War II. And the unique and the blessing after World War II was that there was a very benevolent victor in the United States of America, which rebuilt the countries it vanquished, Japan, Germany, Europe through the Marshall Plan, which, as I mentioned just now, because it constituted 40% of global GDP, every additional dollar generated in the world, 40 cents came back to America. It was worth its while to underwrite that liberal world order that we have enjoyed for the past 80 years. So be realistic, we are no longer in that kind of climate. And as I've said, this is a geostrategic climate change. It's not just a change of weather. So be realistic, be careful, to the maximum extent, continue to hold fast our principles, make common cause wherever possible, but understand that it is not business as usual. I think you had the other question on Israel. It has been difficult for aid to reach the people in Gaza. A combination of reasons. First, the Israelis have been very, very strict because they want to make sure that there's no dual-use equipment getting through the convoys. Secondly, you would have seen videos. The convoys get mobbed the moment they cross over because there's chaos and no security. And it is very dangerous. I mean, we ourselves, as Minister Ng has emphasized, we ourselves have considered how can we even deploy medical or humanitarian facilities, but it is not possible to do so safely. So what we can do is to continue to impress on Israelis that it is in their own interest to facilitate aid deliveries. But I'm afraid they have prioritized their security and other considerations over that. I note that even in the last few days, there's been further hurdles to the delivery of assistance, and to the extent that our voice is heard, we will add to that chorus that says it is in Israel's interest to make sure aid flows to the people who need help.
Monsieur William.
Thank you, sir. I have a clarification on Myanmar and ASEAN. Under the ASEAN 5-point consensus, there seems to be a heavy reliance on a special envoy being appointed to mediate, possibly mediate between the parties, to visit the parties in Myanmar. It has been pointed out by some commentators that one of the difficulties is that because of the annual rotation of country chair in ASEAN, a new special envoy is appointed each year, and it seems that the work sort of starts all over again. So it has been suggested that one of the reforms that could be considered is that ASEAN might set up a permanent secretariat that's dedicated to Myanmar, with staff that specialize in the issue and can provide more institutional memory and support to the special envoy. So I wonder whether that's something that we are pushing for or has been considered.
Minister Balakrishnan.
I think these are all ideas which can be considered. But again, in the spirit of being realistic, Myanmar is a very, very difficult challenge. And the problems that don't just go back to 2021 when the coup was launched, but goes back to the fact that they have never yet been able to truly constitute a single nation out of the diversity that encompasses the totality of Myanmar. So they have not yet been able to work out the political formula to bring people together, to bring all the different elements of state together into a balance which is constructive and positive. So I say all this because to illustrate that they haven't even got past the fundamental nation-building exercise. And the coup is just one more symptom of that fundamental problem. Now, the other point you also need to realize is that we must understand by now external interference. I have seen no historical example of external interference riding in, conquering even, and building a nation. And having elections doesn't solve any political problem if you haven't got the values and that spirit to achieve workable compromises. From my interactions in the past, I have not gone there since 2021, but certainly from my past interactions with Myanmar leaders across the spectrum, I found them, it is very difficult to get them together. So the problem is we can change envoys, we can have special envoys, we can have permanent envoys. That's not the rate limiting factor. And I have consistently urged at ASEAN meetings that you need strategic patience. Because if you get impatient, what are your alternatives? To mount an external operation? It won't work. I guarantee you, it won't work. It won't work militarily, it will not work politically. At the end of the day, these fractured countries, the leaders need to arrive at appropriate political compromise and to create a nation out of very disparate segments who, unfortunately, because so much blood has been shed, have a lot of stored grievances. So, I again caution patience. And, as a doctor, first, do no harm. So our heart bleeds for them. And we have people from Myanmar in Singapore. I'm sure, you're also speaking from direct experience. And it is heartbreaking for them and their relatives. But be very, very careful not to make things worse. So I'm sorry I do not have a quick solution for Myanmar, except that to the extent that they're willing to compromise, any ASEAN country, all ASEAN countries will be most happy to support them. And that was the formula behind the 5-point consensus. If you look at the points there, and they arose out of a speech which Senior Minister Lee made at that special meeting that was convened in April 21 in Jakarta, where all the ASEAN countries were represented, including the military leader in Myanmar. But I'm sorry to say, there has been no progress.
Mr. Jarogia.
So Minister Maliki talked about stepping up our engagement with Africa. I believe we currently only have one resident mission in sub-Saharan Africa. And are there plans to open up more embassies, high commissions, or trade offices in growing and influential African countries like Nigeria and Kenya, as well as in South America? Beyond consular assistance, this could be another step towards diversifying our economic and diplomatic interests beyond the major powers, which is what I raised in my cut as well.
Minister Maliki.
I thank Mr. Jarogia for the question. I go back to, I think Mr. Jarogia used to be a MFA officer. He understands the challenges with regards to manpower. And I think if we are able to have more resources, we will be able to do more. But the reality is that resources are limited, and we ensure that when we decide to establish or open a new embassy or a new mission in any city or any country, it's because we see there's potential for relationship to be established at a higher level. So we start off with ascertaining the potential for collaboration with a particular country. Africa is seen as an emerging country. We do have non-resident ambassadors already appointed in several African countries. And the non-resident ambassadors have done an excellent job for us. They started looking at various areas of collaboration, establish relationship with key leaders in those African countries, and you will see the evolution of us setting up missions in countries from starting from the work of some of our NREs. We will continue to review the African countries and potential for Africa as a region for us to see if we will be able to set up new missions in that area. I'm pretty sure when the time comes and when we see the potential being a lot more real, and we will then be able to make those decisions. But for now, I want to assure Mr. Giam that our NRAs have done an excellent job. We continue to also have systems where ambassadors in one particular mission are also accredited into another country. So it doesn't mean that without a mission that those countries are not taken care of. We continue to pay attention to the various accounts of the different countries in the African region as with any other region, and we continue to assess the extent to which we are able to set up new missions depending on the resources that are available.
Mr. Sito Ipin.
Sir, I'd like to go back to the first half of this COS when Minister Vivian and many of us acknowledge that we are living in a topsy-turvy, troublesome, turbulent world. Because it's not only taking away the idea of rule of law, it's also something along the lines that Mike is right and big is beautiful. Minister alluded to SG 60 just now, very briefly. But really, 60 years of a wonderful nation building is not enough. We want 600 years and beyond. So from an MFA perspective, what's the plan? That's all. Thank you.
Minister Balakrishnan.
I almost looking at that. This is a prime ministerial question. But more seriously, I think historically, Venice as a city-state survived for several centuries. But actually, in the long run of history, has not been kind for tiny city-states. Let's just take that first point, historical. Second point, as it relates to Singapore, 60 years ago, for the sake of a belief in an ideal that we will be a multiracial society, a Singaporean Singapore, not based on being an Indian, Malay, or Chinese nation. We were evicted from Malaysia, and we lost a hinterland. As a consequence of that, we should be grateful. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, Mr. S. Rajaratnam decided that the loss of our immediate hinterland does not have to mean that we are cut off from our supplies and the economic opportunities. And the concept, if you read the speeches in the 60s, the concept of being a global city, of leapfrogging even our immediate neighborhood came about. That was brilliant, but in my speech, what I was also trying to say, that concept worked at a very unusual time in global history. Unusual because it was Pax Americana, characterized by free trade, global supply chains, expansions of multinational enterprises, multilateral organizations, international law. Can you see how that global environment was so conducive to this fledgling, unlikely city-state trying to forge and make a living as a global city? So fast forward to today, I think our pioneer leaders managed to capture every gust of wind that was available. We were an entrepôt. You look at PSA, airports, our trade volume, more than 3 times our GDP. No other political entity has that ratio in the world. Out of just imagination and gumption, we became a global financial center. We became a major logistics center. We became a repository for intellectual property. And then we also benefited not just because of the rule of law and common law and the fact that our legislations, and our bureaucracy and legislation fitted quite easily into the British common law and therefore by extension even the American system. We had all these companies coming in. So can you see my point? That yes, of course, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, once when I was sailing in with him along in Marina Bay before it became closed, actually we were looking for where to place the integrated resorts. But as we were sailing in one sunset, I saw this beautiful landscape. I turned to him, and Mr. Lim Kim San was beside him. I said, how do you feel, Mr. Lee, seeing this wonderful city? He just looked at me gruffly and said, hardworking and disciplined people built all this. No fancy theory, just hardworking and disciplined people built all this. So yes, hardworking and disciplined people called Singaporeans built all this. And today, now 60 years later, I know I'm trying not to be too partisan and too political, but seriously, I remember Mr. Neil Parekh saying last week, if our biggest criticism is that we've been lucky and we've got unanticipated high corporate taxes because companies have come here and their activities have been successful, and we are being criticized for having large fiscal reserves. Well, I appeal to the opposition. Given the state of the world today, do you want to be a net creditor? Even the United States is wondering how to pay off its national debt. Or do you want to be a net debtor, paying off your debts? Or are we better off with a significant reserves, and between the return on reserves or corporate tax competing to see which one is bigger? Can you see there's great reason to be grateful, right? So understand how blessed we have been by the pioneer leaders and the hardworking and disciplined Singaporeans and the global environment, which was very kind to us. Now I'm saying the rules have changed. We're going to a more hostile, more difficult environment. But I'm also saying, please don't be pessimistic and don't lose hope, because we have strengths. Having those reserves, having the fiscal strength, having, the debate which we're having now on the budget is, I think, unique in the world. No one else is facing this luxury, where the finance minister, the prime minister, can put significant sums in long-term funds to invest in our people, in our infrastructure, and to make ourselves future ready. So, I can't look 600 years, but let's just settle for 10 years, right? What are the opportunities in the next 10 years? And I've said, well, maybe I'm biased as a doctor, as a surgeon, but I happen to believe digital technologies and AI, biotechnology, because in fact, healthcare and biology has now become an extension of digital technologies. It is digital technologies that enable the acceleration of the Human Genome Project. It is digital technologies that enable us now to solve the issue of protein folding and to create designer molecules, designer drugs. There's so much there. And we haven't even started about editing the human genome. And green energy, sustainable energy, because guess what? AI requires a lot of energy. But in fact, the challenge of climate change can be solved with current technologies if we get our legislative and our policy structures right. So my point is I'm actually excited because I see a world in which there are revolutions with great opportunities. And I am confident that the strengths of a city-state with fiscal reserves and that a prime minister or a foreign minister of Singapore, at least in the next 10 years, does not have to go to any other capital or any other office with his hands asking for help. Anything which we want, we buy, we pay full market price. So we say we are your partner. We are not your vassal state or your tributary. And therefore, hopefully, no one treats us shabbily. They treat us with some reasonable respect because, we're a partner or we're a customer, a high-value customer. That is, to me, an enormous advantage. And then we continue to invest in our people and our infrastructure, future-proof them, and we continue to remain an open city. That openness is also critical to the long-term survival of a city-state. History has shown that. Even if you go back to the early states of Venice and all that, the thing about a city is that it must always act as a magnet for ideas, for talent, for opportunities. So therefore, I'm very tempted to say the best is yet to be, but I believe that.
On that note of cautious optimism, Mr. Balakrishnan, would you like to withdraw your amendment?
I'd like to thank Minister Vivian Balakrishnan, Minister Maliki Osman, and SMS Siman for sharing the work of the ministry, and of course all the staff in the ministry and all our missions abroad for their hard work carrying our flag. Chairman, I seek leave to withdraw my card.